The camera opens on a quiet evening in Ouagadougou. The city lights shimmer softly, but the tone on national television is tense. The anchor's voice cuts through the silence, calm, formal, but unmistakably serious. Bonsoir, Monsieur le Ministre. Is it true that Burkinabè citizens will now have to go to Togo to apply for a U.S. visa? In that moment, what sounded like an online rumor suddenly becomes official truth. The United States has confirmed through its embassy that it is suspending all tourist and student visas for Burkinabè citizens, forcing them to travel abroad for the process. For most countries, this would pass as routine diplomacy. But for Burkina Faso, a nation rebuilding its soul under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this was more than a bureaucratic slap. It was a message, a reminder that saying no to Washington comes with a price. As the foreign minister begins to speak, the mood changes. He doesn't sound like a man making excuses. He sounds like a man drawing a line in the sand. Le Burkina Faso est une destination, he says firmly. Pas une terre de déportation. Burkina Faso is a destination, not a dumping ground for deportees. It's not just about visas anymore. It's about dignity. About a small African nation daring to define what respect means on its own terms in front of the world. So tonight we ask, is this what global partnership looks like, or is it pressure disguised as diplomacy? Is Washington's visa ban really about policy or about punishment if you believe that sovereignty should never be up for sale? If you believe that dignity is worth more than a stamp on a passport, then stay with me until the end. Because this story is not about immigration. It's about how Ibrahim Traoré turned humiliation into honor and how one small nation just reminded the world what freedom truly means. It began as a whisper, a rumor shared across social media in Burkina Faso that the United States had quietly suspended all tourist and student visas for Burkinabè citizens. Most dismissed it at first. Impossible, they said. Washington would never do that without reason. But by sunset, confirmation arrived. The U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou delivered a note verbal, a formal diplomatic message confirming the decision. It stated that Burkina Faso had failed to comply with U.S. visa usage policies, citing cases of tourists and students who overstayed their permitted time. On paper, it sounded procedural, but the timing and the tone said something else. That same evening, at exactly 8:00 p.m. local time, the Minister of Foreign Affairs appeared live on national television. The studio lights reflected off his glasses as he adjusted the paper in front of him, the U.S. note itself. He said, we have indeed received this note confirming the suspension of visa services. But let me be clear, there is more behind this than simple administration. For the first time, he revealed what had never been made public. The U.S. had approached Burkina Faso multiple times, first during the Trump administration, with a proposal that, if accepted, would have turned the nation into a reception zone for deportees from the United States. They asked if our country, he said, would be willing to receive not only our own citizens expelled from America, but also others, individuals from various nations deemed undesirable. The audience fell silent. Viewers across the country, elders, students, soldiers all stopped what they were doing. You could hear the unspoken thought, was this visa ban a punishment for saying no? According to the minister, the government had called the proposal indecent and contrary to the values of dignity that form the core of President Ibrahim Traoré's vision for a new Burkina Faso. We are a free nation, he said. A land of welcome, but never a land of deportation. He reminded the viewers that when Captain Traoré announced the free African visa policy earlier that year, granting visa-free access to all Africans, Washington saw it as an opportunity. They returned with a new offer. Since your visas are now free, they asked, would you be open to hosting non-Burkinabè nationals deported from the U.S.? This time, the refusal was even firmer. Anyone from Africa who freely decides to visit our land, pays their ticket, and wishes to live among us is welcome, the minister declared. But no one will be forced upon us. We will not accept human beings as cargo. His words struck deep. They weren't spoken with anger, but with conviction. It wasn't the tone of defiance for defiance's sake. It was the tone of a nation defending its dignity after centuries of being told what to do. Within hours, clips from the broadcast flooded social media. Hashtags like Nane Faso Dignity and Visa of Respect began trending across West Africa. Many saw it as yet another chapter in Ibrahim Traoré's quiet revolution, a movement rooted not in confrontation, but in moral clarity. Even within Burkina Faso's own borders, the reaction was mixed but unified in emotion. Older generations remembered past humiliations, the era when African nations had to ask permission to host their own people. Young citizens, meanwhile, shared messages of pride. We may not have wealth, one student wrote, but we have something stronger: self-respect. As the minister concluded, he placed the note verbally back on the table and looked straight into the camera. The United States may suspend its visas, he said calmly, but it cannot suspend our sovereignty. Outside the streets of Ouagadougou buzzed with conversations. Taxi drivers, cafe owners, and soldiers all repeated the same phrase that had just echoed across the nation: Le Burkina Faso est une destination, pas une terre de déportation. And with that, what began as a rumor had transformed into a defining moment in the country's new diplomacy, a confrontation not of armies or sanctions, but of principles and pride. The interview was supposed to be a calm diplomatic update, but halfway through something changed. The anchor leaned forward and asked the question everyone in the country was thinking: Monsieur le Ministre, do you believe this is just coincidence or retaliation for saying no to the United States? A faint smile crossed the minister's face. He adjusted his microphone, paused, and then spoke slowly, deliberately. Let's just say, our categorical refusal came right before their decision. The air in the studio froze. It wasn't anger in his voice, it was certainty. Everyone watching at home understood what that meant. The so-called visa suspension wasn't about paperwork, it was about pressure, a form of diplomatic punishment wrapped in bureaucratic language. He went on to explain that just days earlier the U.S. Embassy had again revived the same discussion, this time trying to reframe it as humanitarian cooperation. But Burkina Faso, he said, would not be fooled. We are a people who understand the difference between cooperation and coercion. And then came the words that would echo across Africa: we are open to all Africans who come freely, but we are not a land where others can be dumped under constraint. We are a destination of dignity, not a destination of deportation. The studio fell silent. The anchor's eyes widened, and millions of viewers from Ouagadougou to Bamako stopped breathing for a moment. It was more than a statement. It was a declaration of moral sovereignty. By the next morning, the phrase had become a rallying cry. On radio shows, callers repeated it with pride. Teachers opened their classes with it. Market vendors painted it on cardboard and taped it above their stalls. Pas une terre de déportation. For a country that had long been treated as a footnote in global politics, those 6 words were like thunder. But the storm did not stop at the borders. Across the Sahel, the governments of Mali and Niger, both close allies in the ES alliance, expressed open solidarity. Their spokespersons called the U.S. move a regrettable display of arrogance. In Bamako, local newspapers wrote, "When a small nation refuses humiliation, it speaks for all of Africa." Meanwhile, in Washington, silence. No official statement, only a short press release from the State Department claiming that the decision was a procedural measure related to consular efficiency. But African commentators weren't buying it. They connected the dots: the refusal to host U.S. deportees, the free visa policy for Africans, the growing cooperation with Russia and China. For them, the message was clear: Burkina Faso was being punished for standing up, for trying to build an Africa that stands on its own feet. Back in Ouagadougou, the reaction among ordinary citizens deepened. University students organized public debates under the theme "Dignity has no price." Artists painted murals of Ibrahim Traoré, half in his military uniform, half in the robes of a peacemaker, beneath the caption, "You can cancel a visa, but you can't cancel our dignity." Even the diaspora community joined in. Burkinabè, living in Paris, Montreal, and New York, released an open letter condemning the U.S. decision, calling it an insult to a people whose only crime is independence. At the center of it all, President Ibrahim Traoré remained silent. No speech, no press conference. Just one photograph released by the presidency: Traoré seated at his desk reading the same diplomatic note the minister had held on live television. Behind him, the national flag. On the wall, a simple inscription: La patrie ou la mort. To the people of Burkina Faso, that silence spoke louder than words. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of control, the silence of a man who understood that sometimes dignity doesn't need to shout. The next day, the Foreign Ministry's statement concluded with a final line that summed up the nation's resolve. "We will respond with reciprocity, not hostility. We will defend our sovereignty without compromising our humanity." And just like that, a small country in West Africa turned what was meant to be a diplomatic humiliation into a symbol of continental pride. A story not of punishment, but of power. Not of weakness, but of worth. The morning after the announcement, Ouagadougou woke up differently. The streets were alive with conversation, not anger, but a calm, dignified defiance. Taxi drivers talked politics for the first time in years. Market women greeted each other not with bonjour, but with a proud smile and the words, "We are not a land of deportation." At first, the U.S. visa suspension seemed like a bureaucratic inconvenience. But as the truth spread that it followed Burkina Faso's refusal to host America's deportees, it began to feel like a national awakening. University students at Joseph Kizerbo campus painted banners that read, "Dignity is the only visa we need." Civil society groups, church leaders, and youth movements held open-air gatherings across the capital, not to protest, but to reaffirm their unity. From the working-class neighborhoods of Tampuy to the dusty towns of Kaya and Bobo Dioulasso, people repeated the same message: if this is the price of independence, we are ready to pay it. Inside the government, the ripple effects were immediate. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs convened an emergency session to assess reciprocal measures, a standard diplomatic principle, but this time carrying emotional weight. The debate was not about punishing the United States, it was about defining the line between sovereignty and submission. One senior official quoted anonymously said, "For decades, our governments feared losing aid or access. But now, we finally have a leader who values respect more than approval." Across social media, the tone shifted from confusion to clarity. The phrase visa bond turned into visa stand. Burkina Faso's refusal became a metaphor for standing tall when others bend. Even in rural villages far from embassies and politics, elders gathered under the trees to listen to the evening news. When they heard the minister's words, "Burkina Faso est une terre de dignité," many nodded quietly as if hearing the echo of Thomas Sankara himself. It was as though the spirit of a generation long gone had returned to guide a new one. Politically, the move strengthened President Ibrahim Traoré's moral standing at home and abroad. Critics who once accused him of being too radical now called him le président de la dignité. His popularity surged especially among youth who saw him not as a soldier, but as a symbol of justice. Yet, the government tread carefully. Traoré's administration made it clear that this was not a call to hostility with America, but a call to mutual respect. In a carefully worded statement, the ministry said diplomacy must be grounded in equality. Partnership cannot exist where dignity is denied. This distinction mattered. It reminded the world that Burkina Faso was not choosing isolation, it was choosing integrity. By refusing to become a dumping ground for unwanted people, the nation defended not only itself, but also the principle that no country, no matter how small, should be treated as disposable. Across the Sahel, ordinary citizens in Mali, Niger, and even Chad echoed that sentiment. They saw in Burkina Faso's stand a reflection of their own frustrations with Western paternalism. A popular Malian radio host said, "At best, Burkina Faso didn't lose a visa. It gained respect." And for millions watching from Africa to the African-American diaspora, that line carried profound meaning. Because what the world witnessed was not a poor country defying a rich one. It was a proud people reclaiming their voice, their story, and their worth. When the sun set that evening, the red, green, and gold flag over Ouagadougou seemed to wave a little stronger in the wind. And the people below it, though still facing hardship, walked a little taller. They had lost access to American visas. But they had gained something far more valuable, a renewed sense of dignity that no embassy could ever grant or take away. In Washington, the reaction was calculated and cautious. The State Department released a short statement carefully worded to sound procedural. This measure is not punitive, it is administrative. But behind closed doors, diplomatic analysts knew what it really was: a message. For decades, Washington's foreign policy in Africa has relied on quiet compliance, aid for obedience, access for silence. But Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré had broken that unspoken rule. By rejecting America's proposal to host deportees and by offering free visas to Africans, the country had redefined what sovereignty looked like, and that made Washington uncomfortable. American media paid little attention at first. The story was buried beneath headlines about the Middle East and global inflation. But independent voices, especially among the African-American community, began to ask questions. Why punish a nation for refusing to be a dumping ground? Why silence a leader who speaks of dignity? For some older Americans who remember the civil rights era, Traoré's stance carried a familiar ring: the courage to say no to injustice, no matter who wields the power. Meanwhile, in Europe, the reactions were split. French outlets treated the visa suspension as a minor diplomatic incident. But in Africa, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, it was front-page news. Editorials praised Burkina Faso's integrity. African newspapers described it as an acte de courage diplomatique. In Bamako, Mali's state TV aired a special report titled "The New Voice of the Sahel," framing the Burkina Faso response as a turning point, the moment when African nations stopped asking permission to exist with dignity. In Addis Ababa, African Union observers privately discussed whether the visa retaliation could set a precedent. Could a small nation really teach the world a lesson in equality, even in the corridors of the United Nations? Whispers began. One delegate from Latin America reportedly said, "This isn't just about visas. It's about who gets to define human worth in the 21st century." But not all voices agreed. Some Western commentators accused Burkina Faso of victim politics, arguing that refusing to cooperate with the U.S. on deportations was short-sighted. Others worried that this defiance could push the nation further toward Russia and China. And yet those criticisms missed the deeper truth: Burkina Faso wasn't rejecting the West. It was rejecting humiliation. It wasn't choosing sides. It was choosing self-respect. In American think tanks, quiet debates unfolded. A senior analyst at the Council on Foreign Relations reportedly said, "We underestimated the emotional resonance of sovereignty in Africa. Traoré may be the first African leader of his generation to turn dignity into a diplomatic weapon." That idea, dignity as diplomacy, began circulating among Pan-African intellectuals and even diaspora academics in Atlanta, New York, and Kingston. They saw in Ibrahim Traoré a reflection of something long forgotten: the moral fire that once burned in leaders like Thomas Sankara and Nelson Mandela. For the first time in years, an African president's decision was not framed as rebellion, but as a lesson in moral clarity. Burkina Faso had reminded the world that sovereignty is not isolation. It is the freedom to decide one's own boundaries, material and moral alike. And as the U.S. visa ban lingered, something unexpected happened. It was Washington, not Ouagadougou, that began to lose face. Because in trying to discipline a small African nation, America accidentally showcased its own hypocrisy. The world saw a country that preaches liberty, yet punishes those who live it. And for millions watching from afar, one question echoed louder than any press release: has America forgotten what dignity looks like? The screen fades to black, but the message lingers. This was never just about visas. It was about the quiet war for dignity, fought not with weapons, but with words, principles, and restraint. Burkina Faso may not have skyscrapers or billion-dollar banks, but it has something more enduring: a moral backbone. When the world expected submission, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government chose sovereignty. When power demanded obedience, they answered with self-respect. And in doing so, they exposed an uncomfortable truth: that in the 21st century, dignity has become revolutionary. Tonight, as we reflect from across the ocean, we must ask ourselves, what does it mean when a nation that speaks of freedom punishes another for claiming it? What does it say about the West and about us when a small African country must remind us what humanity looks like? Maybe this story isn't just about Burkina Faso. Maybe it's about all of us, about how easily we trade integrity for convenience, and how rarely we notice when courage speaks softly. So the next time you hear about sanctions, suspensions, or administrative measures, remember this moment when a humble nation looked into the eyes of a superpower and said, "We will not be a land of deportation." Because somewhere between those words lies the future of Africa and perhaps the redemption of us all. If you believe that dignity still matters more than dominance, share this story. If you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's stand for sovereignty deserves to be heard, don't stay silent. Subscribe not for the noise of the headlines, but for the truth that still whispers beneath them.